By the time Raymond Colt walked into that pharmacy, he had already broken 3 men that morning and felt nothing about any of it. He needed something for the headaches. What he got instead was Nora Voss, and a quiet that settled over him like the first snow he'd seen in years. He didn't know what to do with that. So he did what he always did with things he didn't understand. He filed it away. He came back the next day, and the day after that. 6 weeks later, she became his wife on paper, and he told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. He just didn't find out how wrong until someone tried to take her from him. Nora Voss had been running the Halsted Street pharmacy for 4 years by the time Raymond Colt stepped through her door. She was 31, full-figured in the unhurried way of a woman who hadn't spent a single hour of her adult life apologizing for it. With dark hair she kept pinned back because loose hair was impractical behind a dispensing counter. She had a pharmacist's license, a master's degree in clinical toxicology from the University of Illinois, and a memory for drug interactions that her professors had called unnerving. She also had her mother's medical debt, a lease renewal she couldn't afford, and zero interest in the kind of men who usually walked into her pharmacy at 8 in the morning looking like they owned the sidewalk. Raymond Colt looked like he owned the entire block. He was 44, broad through the shoulders, with gray coming in at his temples and eyes that processed the room the way security cameras did. Not looking for anything in particular, cataloging everything. He set a handwritten list on her counter, not a prescription, just a list, and said, "Tell me what I can't combine." She looked at the list. She looked at him. She told him exactly what he couldn't combine and why, in the flat clinical tone she used with everyone. Most people thanked her and left. Raymond stayed for 11 minutes asking follow-up questions, which told her he'd understood everything she'd said on the first pass and was doing something else entirely. She didn't ask what. She filled the order, he paid in cash, and left. He came back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. She never asked why a man with obvious resources was using a neighborhood pharmacy instead of having someone handle it. He never explained. What she noticed and filed away without examining was that he always waited for other customers to leave before approaching the counter, not impatiently, deliberately. The arrangement Raymond proposed 6 weeks later was delivered in the same register he used to ask about drug interactions, clear, efficient, stripped of ornamentation. He needed a wife on paper, someone clean, no criminal record, no ties to the families already in play. The IRS was conducting a review and certain assets needed to be structured differently, and a domestic partner with legitimate professional income and no history in his world was architecturally useful. In return, Nora's mother's debt would be retired, the pharmacy lease would be secured for 10 years, and Nora herself would receive a monthly transfer that was, by any measure, more than fair. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I'll need the terms in writing." He almost smiled, almost. They were married at the Cook County Clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 witnesses who worked for Raymond and a ceremony that lasted 4 minutes. She kept her name professionally. He didn't object. They maintained separate residences. She appeared at 2 dinners per month, sat beside him, spoke when addressed, and conducted herself in a way that Raymond later described to his attorney as completely unimpeachable. He paid her. She fulfilled the arrangement. Neither of them spoke about anything that wasn't directly related to the logistics of the arrangement, except on the nights when the dinner conversation lagged, and Raymond would ask her something about pharmacology. And she would answer, and somehow 30 minutes would disappear, and the table would still be full of people who had stopped pretending to talk to each other. She didn't think about what that meant. He didn't either. What neither of them had considered was Marco Tessari. Marco Tessari had been Raymond's partner in 3 legitimate businesses and 6 illegitimate ones for 9 years. He was 51, slight, with the nervous precision of a man who had survived in dangerous company, not through strength, but through being indispensable. He knew where money was buried in every sense of the phrase. He knew which judges needed what, and he had spent the better part of a decade cultivating the quiet certainty that Raymond Colt could not function without him. He wasn't wrong exactly, but he wasn't as right as he believed. And when Raymond's IRS situation resolved faster than expected and certain restructuring made Marco's specific knowledge marginally less critical, Marco felt it. Men like Marco always feel the precise moment their leverage begins to shift. He started watching Nora. He came into the pharmacy on a Thursday, not a Tuesday, so Raymond wasn't expected, wasn't there, had no reason to be. There was a line of 5 customers, a teenage girl dropping off a prescription, an elderly man asking about blood pressure medication. Marco positioned himself at the back of the line and waited. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they have decided in advance what they're going to do. When it was his turn, he stepped to the counter. He set both hands flat on the surface. He looked at Nora with an expression that was almost pleasant, and he said, loudly enough for the remaining customers to hear, "I heard Colt keeps you around because you're useful. I'm trying to figure out how, because it's not like he needed a pharmacist. Must be lonely for a man like that to have to buy himself something this size just to make the books look clean." The girl at the back of the store went still. The elderly man looked away. Nora did not flinch. She held Marco's gaze and said nothing for 3 full seconds, which is longer than it sounds when the room is that quiet. Then she said, "Is there something I can help you with today?" Her voice was level, professional. She had learned very young that the most disarming thing a woman could do in a room full of people who wanted her rattled was to give them nothing to hold on to. Marco smiled, said no, and left. What Raymond Colt knew about that interaction, he knew because the elderly man in line had worked for him for 20 years and called him before Marco's car had turned off Halstead. Raymond listened to the account without speaking. When it was finished, he said, "Thank you," and ended the call and stood at his window for a long time looking at nothing. Psychologists call this particular response inhibited emotional processing, the phenomenon by which individuals who have suppressed emotional responsiveness across years of high-threat environments don't register feelings in real time, but instead experience them hours or days later, often as physical sensation rather than named emotion. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk documented this in his foundational work on trauma and the body, noting that the nervous system stores what the mind refuses to file. Raymond Colt had headaches. Had had them for years. They had started, though he'd never connected the chronology, approximately 18 months after he'd stopped being capable of feeling afraid of anything. Standing at that window, his head did not hurt at all. He did not call Nora. He did not send anyone to check on her. He noted this choice and moved on. What Raymond did not know, what no one knew, was what Nora had done after Marco left. She had served the remaining customers. She had locked up at 6. He had gone home, made tea, and opened her laptop and begun doing what she had been quietly doing for 3 weeks, tracing the financial architecture of the IRS review that had brought Raymond Colt into her pharmacy in the first place. Not because he had asked her to, because 2 of the accounts Raymond had mentioned in their initial arrangement had flagged something in her memory, specific account structures she'd seen before, in her uncle's business, shortly before it had been systematically drained by a partner who'd been feeding information to a competitor. She had said nothing because she had no proof. She was building proof. Nora's clinical toxicology background was, at its core, a degree in following invisible processes to their source. She applied the same methodology to money. The pattern she found over 3 weeks of careful work told a story that was both simple and devastating. Marco Tessari had been feeding structured financial data from Raymond's operations to the IRS review, not as a loyalty move and not as self-protection, but as a stage-clearing exercise. He was trying to create a legal crisis severe enough to force Raymond into a partnership restructuring, one that would give Marco primary signatory authority over the 3 legitimate businesses. He had done this before, to someone else, in a smaller city. That case had never been prosecuted because the victim hadn't survived long enough to press charges. She knew what she had. She also knew that Marco now knew she existed as a variable. What she didn't expect was for him to move that fast. The man appeared at her apartment door the following evening, presenting himself as a courier. She did not open the door. She had lived 31 years as a woman alone in a city, and she had the specific situational awareness that produces. She noted the shoes visible under the door gap, the slight asymmetry in his knock. She stepped back, called Raymond's number, and said without preamble, "I have documentation of what Marco is doing to your accounts, and I have a man outside my door who isn't a courier. I'm sending you the files right now. Whatever happens next, you have what you need." She sent the files. Then she called 911, reported a suspicious individual at her address, and sat down to wait with her phone in her hand and the calm of a woman who had done what she could with the information available to her. Raymond arrived before the police did. The man outside her door was gone by then. Raymond stood in her kitchen and looked at the open laptop and the spreadsheets she'd built and said nothing for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known?" She said, "3 weeks." He said, "Why didn't you say anything?" She met his eyes. "Because I needed to be certain, and because I wasn't sure you'd believe me over someone you've worked with for 9 years. He looked at her. Something in his face moved, which was notable because his face almost never moved. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her and said, "Show me." She showed him. This is what John Gottman, after 4 decades studying human connection, identified as the moment of turning toward the pivot point in any relationship where one person chooses full presence over self-protection. It is, Gottman argued, not the grand gestures, but these small, irreversible choices that determine whether 2 people become something real. Raymond Colt, who had arranged a marriage for tax efficiency and called it nothing, chose to sit down at Nora Voss's kitchen table at 9:30 on a Thursday night and let her show him the thing that would change everything. Marco Tessari was not arrested. The material Nora had assembled was delivered through channels that bypassed formal process entirely, in a manner that ensured Marco's exposure to exactly the people he had been double-crossing. His exit from Raymond's professional world was quiet, total, and irreversible. He lost the 3 businesses. He lost the accounts. He lost the thing he had spent 9 years building. Raymond said 3 words to him at their final meeting, and none of them required raising his voice. The public accounting came separately. Nora had preserved copies of everything, including Marco's pharmacy visit, which had been captured on the store's camera system. The footage was distributed with surgical precision to the precise social and professional circles where Marco's reputation still carried value. Whatever he had hoped to accomplish by walking into that store and saying what he said about her in front of witnesses, the record that remained was not the one he had intended to leave. There was no dramatic scene. No confrontation where Raymond declared himself. What happened was slower and quieter and more like a structural change than an event. The dinners became less performative. The conversations that had always started about pharmacology and wandered somewhere else without warning started to be understood by both of them as what they actually were. Raymond stopped referring to the arrangement in formal terms. Nora stopped counting the monthly transfers. One evening, after a dinner where they had stayed at the table long after everyone else had left, Raymond said, "I told you when we started that I don't do this." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I was wrong about that." She said, "I know that too." He wasn't a man who found it easy to be known. He had spent a long time making sure he wasn't. But there is a specific kind of undoing that happens when someone sees your entire architecture, financial, professional, psychological, and chooses to stay anyway, not out of dependency or fear, but out of something quieter and more voluntary than either. Nora Voss had looked at Raymond Colt's world clearly, understood exactly what it was, built him a lifeline he hadn't asked for at personal risk to herself, and then sat down to wait without drama. He hadn't been saved by her. He'd been seen by her. That turned out to be harder to walk away from than any threat he'd ever faced. The headaches, for what it's worth, stopped. Not all at once. Gradually, the way things do when something that has been held very tightly is finally allowed to be put down. If this story stayed with you, that feeling is worth something. A like takes 2 seconds and tells me these stories matter. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. The people who show up are the ones I write for.